Welcome to How to Equip Team Members for Effective Engagement. We basically have two goals for this call. One is to give you as area coordinators or ministry coordinators the behind the scenes look at how to prepare to equip your team. And then two, to give you a PowerPoint that you can use as you're equipping your teams to engage and on what effective engagement looks like. So slides 1 through 9 are going to be geared towards area coordinators and ministry coordinators as a preparation tool. And then slides 10 through the end are slides that you can use to share with your team as you're training and equipping them on engaging. So we've got a couple of objectives for today's call. One is to enable you to equip your teams for effective engagement. And then two is to provide you with the tools to supplement the engagement information that is in the handbook so that you can then tell, show, watch, and let your team members do and provide feedback for them. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like here in a minute. So a win for us for this call would be for you to be able to host an effective equipping session on engagement with your team. So let's talk a little bit about preparation. Preparation for equipping is vital, just like for anything else you go to do. And so I just encourage you to plan time to prepare, especially if you've been doing this a long time. I found myself, as I approached this topic, I felt like I knew a lot about it. I've been doing this for 5 years. And as I went through the handbook and took the time to prepare and really think through practical examples, I realized I had a lot to learn and I had a lot to refresh on. So just be prepared. And effective equipping takes thought, it takes time, and it takes prayer, and it takes preparation. Then be sure to review your handbook. That's the best place to start. You can look in your handbook and you're going to be looking for what are the tasks that are needed to engage new churches or groups or prayer network partners or media outlets. You can use this training for any of those ministry areas, but you're looking for those specific tasks that are listed. Then you're also going to be looking for what practical exercises are suggested in the handbook. There are some in there that you can use that are really solid and really good. And then finally, you're reminding yourself of the resources that are available in the handbook. Many times I go to find something or create something only to realize that there was already a sample of it in the handbook. So don't make that mistake. Use your handbook. And then the next step in preparation is you want to identify ineffective or challenging areas in the topic in which you're teaching. So for our purposes today, we're looking at engaging. What are the challenges that our teams have with that? And there are really 3 ways to identify those challenges. One is inspection on your team. If you've been doing a good job of keeping up with your team, listening to them, hearing what their challenges and their successes are, then you probably already know these things. But if you're a new AC or if you haven't had the opportunity really to inspect or talk to your teams yet, you might just want to ask them. And I would suggest rather than just asking, because sometimes you don't get the answers you want by just asking a simple question, you might want to develop a survey, a very simple survey that just has the different tasks that are involved with engaging listed on it, and ask each team member to rate themselves with their comfort and skill level on a scale from 1 to 10. And that'll give you a good idea of where your team is and maybe what their areas are where they don't feel completely equipped. And then finally, you can also ask other area coordinators or ministry coordinators, what challenges do your team face? And so that can give you some good information. But however you do it, you do want to identify the ineffective or challenging areas. And then this is how you really build your equipping session. You build your equipping session around those areas that are hard for your team that you want them to be more effective in. And then another great tool for preparation is to develop a rack. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but we want to develop a rack, and there's a copy of a rack in your leadership handbook. It would have been in the general leadership section, but we can send you a copy of a rack if you don't have one of those. Although you don't need a copy of a rack to do one. It's very simple to do, and you don't necessarily have to use the form that we provide. And then finally, you're going to want to determine all 4 areas of the equipping quadrant. And we're going to talk about that here in a minute as well. So let's review our definition of equipping. Equipping is providing the resources, and then transferring the necessary attitudes, competencies, and knowledge so that a volunteer will be effective. So as I mentioned, as we prepare to equip on engagement, it's a good exercise to sit down to fill out the rack. You're going to want to start with your competencies. You're going to want to list out what are the competencies that are needed to be effective at engaging churches. And so we're going to talk through that. What are the competencies needed? And typically your competencies, once you've identified the challenges that your team is having, then that's going to fill in your competencies. And we'll kind of demonstrate that later on. If they're struggling, that's going to be your competency that you want to transfer. So let's start there. Let's start with what are our engagement challenges. And yours may be a little bit different from this, and that's okay. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just a list that I came up with from my experience, and if I had a team, this is what I would want to talk to them about. So the first challenge I've identified is that it's difficult for them to determine the best prospects to contact and prioritize a list. In fact, I was at a team meeting recently, and one of the team members asked, when are the prospective church lists going to be ready? And we do have those lists, and they're a useful tool for some situations, but in my mind, they're not the best tool we have. And if somebody is asking for the prospective church list, it indicates to me that they may not have any better ideas of who to contact, that they might have connections with. And so I find that that's a challenge, developing a really good prospect list. The second one is getting an audience with the prospect. One AC did some research with her team and just asked them to keep track of how many calls they made to engage a new church or group, and then how many meetings they actually were able to get. And her research identified that for every 5 calls, they resulted in 2 face-to-face meetings. So it kind of gives you an idea of a challenge that we have. I mean, we would, of course, love for every call we make to get a presentation with that person. And so we want to see those numbers improve and go from 2 to 3 to 4 and maybe eventually even 5. And so that's an area where we know that we have some opportunity to work. And so this is going to be a competency that we're going to teach to in our engagement training. And then finally, the third challenge that I identified was effectively presenting the opportunity in order to secure a face-to-face meeting. So we want to, like I said, raise the prospects of us getting that face-to-face meeting. So we know that people need to understand, how do you cast vision for the ministry in such a way that you can get that face-to-face meeting? So those are the 3 competencies that we're really going to be teaching to today. How to determine your best prospect list, how to get an audience with the prospect, how to get your foot in the door, and then how to effectively present the opportunity in order to secure a face-to-face meeting. Now, once you've identified your competencies, the next thing you're going to want to do is identify what attitudes does a team member need to have in order to possess these competencies. So attitude is what we're going to talk about next. So a couple of things I identified, and again, this isn't exhaustive. You may have some different attitudes, but I identified 4 or 5 actually. 1, they really need to believe that a strong prospect list is important. If they don't understand why that's important, they're not going to be invested in doing it. 2, they need to be tenacious. They need to have tenacity, courage, perseverance, and confidence. And all of these things are needed because we know, like I just mentioned, that maybe 2 out of 5 calls are going to result in a face-to-face meeting. And if you're not prepared for that, if you're not tenacious, if you don't have confidence in what you're doing and in the Lord and in the message He's given you, that's going to be discouraging. Nobody likes rejection. Nobody likes 2 out of 5 odds. And so we really need to sow in to these attitudes so that they're going to be able to withstand the rejection they may face as they're making these calls. So we've identified the competencies. Now we've identified the attitudes that we need to teach to. And now we're going to focus on knowledge. So knowledge is basically the information that the team member is going to need to be told and shown in order to be competent at their role and in order to have the attitudes that they need to possess for their role. So this is why it's important to do the competencies and attitudes first, because the knowledge is basically fills out how you get there. It's the how to be competent and how to have the attitude. So looking back at our challenges, I went back and said, okay, these are the things that somebody needs to know in order to be competent or in order to have an attitude of tenacity. So the first thing I identified was who to contact. That's what they need to know. They need to know who to contact, which means they need to know how do they work their network. What makes for a warm lead? What's a warm lead versus a cold lead? Who can you get involved through on-ramps? Who do you already have connections with? So it's helping them know and understand how to do these things. Okay. Then the second thing they're going to need to know in order to have the competency of getting an audience is they're going to need to know how to use Google. They're going to need to know some ideas for how to engage people. And they're also going to need to know what we're looking for when we're researching a church or a group. And then the third challenge or competency that we're teaching to is for them to have effective presentations and really be able to share the best possible information to get an audience and be able to get in the door and have a face-to-face meeting. So what they really need to know for this is they need to know and understand and demonstrate how to tailor a message to an audience. How do you do that? And then finally, if we want them to have this attitude of courage and confidence, we need to figure out what do they need to know in order to be courageous and confident in what they're doing. So I've listed a few things here. They need to know the value of the opportunity that we're presenting. They need to be really sold out on that we're offering a really great partnership for them. They need to have realistic expectations. And like we've already mentioned with that statistic, go ahead and let them know it's to be expected that not every call is going to be successful. For every 5 calls, you might get 2 face-to-face meetings. So setting those realistic expectations gives them confidence, and that way they're not going to be crushed, if they have 3 calls and none are successful. They'll expect that. And then finally, just a really solid foundation in the Word. And there's a lot of different scriptures that you could teach from on courage and confidence in the Lord, that He is the one who does the work. And so you can fill that out more, but you definitely would want to have some things in your equipping session that would sew in that courage and confidence. They would have that attitude that we want them to have. All right, and then finally, you look towards the resources and you see, okay, if this is what we want them to do, if this is how we want them to think, if this is what we want them to know, then what physical resources do we need to give them to get there? So the first thing is the handbook, and your team members should all have a copy of that. For your equipping session, I would recommend that you ask them to bring that because you'll be referencing it. And we want to reinforce the importance of that handbook and that it's really a valid tool. We don't want them to get the handbook, read it once, and then put it on their shelf, which quite frankly is what I've done in certain situations. So we want to encourage them. This is actually something that you can refer to and that is really a good tool for you. And inside the handbook, a couple of resources that are there for most ministry areas. There's a sample email, introductory email that they can send, or it can be formatted into the form of a letter. There's a sample script in there for how to make a call and what to say. And in the community relations handbook, there's also a sample presentation outline for when they get to the presentation piece of things that they could use in a presentation. Then the next resource they're going to want to have is their drop-off logs. That to me is the best tool for engaging new churches. It lets us know who participated last year and kind of lets you know who isn't participating in our areas. So you're going to want to make sure that they have their drop-off logs. And then they're going to need access to the internet because what we're doing with engaging is some research, internet research, and so they're going to need access to the internet. So again, this list may not be exhaustive. These are just the ones that I thought of for kind of the way I'm gearing the equipping today, but hopefully that's helpful for you to be able to see this is how thinking through the RAC can be really helpful. Competencies, attitudes, knowledge, and resources, and then you've got a really good package to deliver to your team. So then from there, we're going to start developing our content for our equipping session. So like I mentioned before, the first point is don't reinvent the wheel. Reread your handbook. It's a good resource. And then the second tip on developing content is using your own experiences. The handbook is good information, but it's a little bit dry and it's not personalized. And so as you're reading through the handbook, like what I do is I'm just constantly thinking, okay, what can I share about this? How can I make this more real? How can I connect it to a personal experience? So you can use those and really think through, what have I seen happen on the team? What have some team members do that worked and didn't? Or whatever you're drawing from, just think through personal examples. Okay, so now we're going to talk through engaging prospects. Now this is where